Okay, hi everyone, welcome back to this live stream for Windows Server 2003. So I'll just share my screen. Okay, configuring a router. The first option, configuration page, is the router default gateway page, figure 5.5, in which you enter the IP address of one or more routers that you want to use as gateways for outbound traffic. Type in the IP address of the routers you want to use and then use the up and down buttons to put the address in the order in which you want clients to use them when attempting to send outgoing packets. So you can see here 5.5, the default router page of the new scope wizard. Providing DNS settings on the domain name and DNS servers page, figure 5.6, you specify the set of DNS servers and the parent domain you want passed down to DHCP clients. Normally, you need to specify at least one DNS server by filling in its DNS name or IP address. You can also specify the domain you want Windows Server 2003 to use as its base domain for all connections that don't have their own connection-specific suffixes defined. So you can see here, figure 5.6, the domain name and DNS servers page of the new scope wizard. Providing WINS settings. If you're still using Windows Internet Naming Service WINS on your network, you can configure DHCP so that it passes WINS server addresses to your Windows clients. Though if you want the Windows clients to honor it, you need to define the WINS/NBT node type option for the scope. As on the DNS server page, on the WINS server page, figure 5.7, you can enter the addresses of several servers, moving them into the order in which you want clients to try them. You may enter the DNS or net bias name of each server, or you can enter an IP address. Activating the scope. The activating scope page allows you the option to activate the scope immediately after creating it. By default, the wizard will assume you want the scope activated unless you selecting no, I will activate this scope later radio button, in which case the scope will remain dormant until you manually activate it. So exercise 5.3, creating a new scope. So 1, open the DHCP snap-in by selecting Start Administrative Tools DHCP. 2, right-click the server on which you want to create the new scope and choose New Scope. The new scope wizard appears. 3, click the next button on the welcome page. 4, enter a name and a description for your new scope and click the next button. 5, in the IP address range, enter 192.168.0.2 as the start IP address for the scope and 192.068.0.250 as the end IP address. Leave the subnet mask controls alone, though when creating a scope on a production network, you might need to change them. Click the next button. 6, in the Add Exclusions page, click Next without adding any excluded addresses. 7, in the Lease Duration page, set the lease duration to 3 days and click the next button. 8, in the Configure DHCP Options page, click the next button to indicate that you want to configure default options for this scope. 9, enter a router IP address, in this case 192.168.0.1 in the IP address field, and then click the Add button. Once the address is added, click the next button. 10, in the domain name and DNS servers page, enter the IP address of a DNS server on your network in the IP address field, such as 192.168.0.1 10.251 and click the Add button. Click the Next button. 11. On the Wins server page, click the Next button to leave the Wins options on set and display the active scope page. 12. If your network is currently using the 192.168.0.x range, select No, I will activate this scope later radio button. Click the Next button. When the wizard summary page appears, click the Finish button to create the scope. Changing scope properties. Each scope has a set of properties associated with it, except for the set of options assigned by the scope. More about this in the next section. These properties can be seen on the General tab of the Scope Properties dialog box, figure 5.8. Some of these properties, like the scope name and description, are self-explanatory. Others require a little more exposition. The start IP address and the end IP address fields allows you to set the size of the scope. The subnet mask is automatically calculated for you based on the IP address you enter. The settings in the lease duration for DHCP clients group control how long leases in this scope will be valid. You can choose either the limited to or unlimited radio button. If you choose to set lease duration limits, you can use days, hours, and minutes control to govern how long the leases will remain in use. So you can see here, figure 5.8, the General tab of the Scope Properties dialog box. Managing reservations and exclusions. After defining the address pool, the next step is to create whatever reservations and exclusions you want to reduce the size of the pool. In the following sections, you will see how to add and remove exclusions and reservations. Adding and removing exclusions. When you want to exclude an entire range of IP addresses, you need to add that range as an exclusion. Normally, you'll want to do this before you enable a scope, because that prevents you from accidentally issuing any of the excluded IP addresses. In fact, you can't create an exclusion that includes a leased address. You have to get rid of the lease first. Here's how to add an exclusion range. 1. Open the DHCP snap-in and find the scope to which you want to add an exclusion. 2. Expand the range so you can see its address pool. Item 3. Right-click address pool and then use the new exclusion range command. You can select actions, new exclusion range as well. 4. When the add exclusion dialog box appears, enter the IP address you want to exclude. To exclude a single address, type it into the start IP address field. To exclude a range, put the ending address of the range into the end IP address field. Figure 5.9, the add exclusion dialog box. 5. Click the add button to add the exclusion. When you add exclusions, they appear in the address pool node under the scope where you add them. To remove an exclusion, just right click it and use the delete command. After confirming your command, the snap-in removes the excluded range and it becomes immediately available for issuance. Adding and removing reservations. Adding reservations is simple. As long as you have the MAC address of the device for which you want to create a reservation. Because reservations belong to a single scope, you create and remove them within the reservations node beneath each scope. You add reservations by right-clicking the scope and selecting New Reservation. This displays the new reservation dialog box shown in figure 5.10. So you can see here, figure 5.10, the new reservation dialog box. At a minimum, When you create a new reservation, you must enter the IP address and MAC address for the reservation. If you like, you can also enter a name and description. You can also choose whether the reservation will be made by DHCP only, BOOTP only, useful for remote access devices that use BOOTP or both. To remove a reservation, right-click it and select Delete. This removes the reservation but does nothing to the client device. Setting scope options. Once you've installed a server, authorized it in Active Directory and fixed up the address pool, the next step is to set scope options such as router, i.e. default gateway, the DNS server addresses that you want sent out to clients. You must configure the options you want sent out before you activate a scope. If you don't, clients may register in the scope without getting any options, rendering them virtually useless. Scope options along with the IP address and subnet mask that you configured earlier in this chapter complete the standard TCP IP settings that you saw in chapter 2. In the following sections, you'll learn how to configure and assign scope options on the DHCP server. Understanding option assignment. There are 5 different and slightly overlapping ways to control which DHCP options are doled out to clients. Preferred options. Preferred options are like option templates that are available in the server scope or client options dialog boxes. Server options. Server options are assigned to all scopes and clients of a particular server. That means if there's some setting you want all clients of a DHCP server to have, no matter what scope they're in, this is where you'd assign them. However, note that more specific options, like those that are set at the class, scope, or client level, will override server level options. That gives you an escape valve. It's a better idea, though, to be careful about which options you assign if your server manages multiple scopes. Scope options. If you want a particular option value assigned only to those clients in a certain subnet, select that scope as the base for the option. For example, it's common to specify different routers for different physical subnets. If you have 2 scopes corresponding to different subnets, each scope would probably have a separate value for the router option. Class options. The idea behind class options is that you should be able to assign different options to clients in different classes. For example, Windows 2000 XP and Server 2003 machines recognize a number of DHCP options that Windows 98 and Mac machines ignore. By defining a new Windows 2000 or newer class on the clients using ipconfig/set class ID command you saw earlier, you could assign those options only to machines that report themselves as being in that class. The problem is that you need to have clients that are smart enough to do so, and most of them aren't. Client options. If you want to force certain options onto a specific client, you can do so provided the client is using a DHCP reservation. You can actually attach client options to a particular reservation. They'll override any scope, server, or class option. In fact, the only way to override a client option is to manually configure the client. The DHCP server manages client options, assigning options. You can use the DHCP snap-in to assign options at the scope, server, reserved address, or class level. The mechanism you use to assign these options is identical. The only difference is where you set the options. When you create an option assignment, remember that it applies to all the clients in the server or the scope from that point forward. Option assignments aren't retroactive and they don't migrate from one scope to another. To actually create a new option and have it assigned, select the scope or server where you want the option assigned. Select the corresponding options node and select Action, Configure Options. To set options for a reserved client, right-click its entry in the Reservations node and select Configure Options. You'll then see the Configure Options dialog box, figure 5.11, which lists all of the options you might potentially want to configure. To select an individual option, check the box next to it and then use the controls in the data entry control group to enter the value you want associated with the option. Continue to add options until you've specified all the ones you want attached to the server or scope, and then click the OK button. You saw how to assign classes to individual machines earlier in the chapter. Now you will learn how to configure the DHCP server to recognize your customized classes and configure options for them. In exercise 5.4, you will create a new user class and configure options for the new class. So figure 5.11, the scope options dialog box. Exercise 5.4, configure user class options. So 1, open the DHCP snap-in by selecting Start, Administrative Tools, DHCP. 2, right-click the DHCP server and select Define User Classes. 3, click the Add button in the DHCP User Classes dialog box. 4, in the New Class dialog box, enter a descriptive name for the class. In the Display Name field, enter the class ID in the ID field. Typically, you will enter the class ID in the ASCII portion of the ID field. You should make sure that the computers you want to use in the class have been configured with the ipconfig /set class ID command as described earlier in this chapter. When you are done, click the OK button. 5, the new class appears in the DHCP user classes dialog box. Click the close button to return to the DHCP administrative tool. 6, right-click either the server options or a scope options node, depending on if you want to set the class options at the server or scope level, and select Configure Options. 7, click the Advanced tab, select the class you defined in step 4 from the User Class pull-down menu. 8, configure the options that you want to set for the class. Click OK when you are done. Notice that the options you configured and the class that they are associated with appear in the right pane of the DHCP window. So I'm going to leave it here this evening for this live stream, and thank you for spending the evening with me.